how would you say all of this relates to, let's say, like sexuality versus non-sexuality practices?
Mhm.
Like, do you see distinct markers? You know, is the onset faster, slower?
Well, I mean, taking a big step back again, in Sex, God, and the Brain, I talk about sort of the whole theoretical basis of why
Right.
I was very interested in studying OM in the first place, because of the early work that I had done with my colleague Gene DeQuilly, Dr. Eugene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist and also an anthropologist by training. And so he had done a lot of work looking at rituals and how rituals evolved in human beings, and looking at the idea that, well, if human beings have rituals, they must have evolved from animal rituals. And animals do have a lot of rituals, but they're all mating rituals. So
Right.
theoretically, all human rituals, whether they are mating rituals, which human beings obviously have as well, or other types of rituals, educational, political, religious, and so forth, whether they all kind of evolved out of a kind of an expanded experience of what are fundamentally mating rituals.
Hmm.
And I think that makes a lot of sense, because we are still always talking about, if you kind of compare those core elements that I just mentioned earlier about mystical experiences, the sense of unity. Well, when one mates with another, you have
Right.
a sense of oneness with that person, sense of intensity, absolutely.
Totally.
Uh, um, a sense of clarity is an interesting one. I mean, because obviously in human beings and in a number of animals, that clarity has to do a little bit with how we perceive our relationships in the world, and the idea of who we connect with. And so, I mean, as they always say, sex changes the relationship, because now it's
Yeah.
like, okay, this is the person that I'm supposed to be with, or whatever. So there is this sort of sense of, this is what I need to do now, in order to continue on in life, or continue on with this individual. And of course, with sexuality as well, with sexual experience, there is that sense of, even though there's this engaged process, at some point, especially as a person achieves climax, you don't control it at some point.
Mm.
It is something that kind of takes you over. So I think that there's a lot to be said for this relationship between sexual experiences and sexual practices and spiritual practices and experiences. And again, certainly elaborate on that in the book. Um, as far as it's always becomes more challenging to start comparing practices in terms of ease, difficulty. I mean, there may be some people who respond great to some practices and not to others, and so forth. But certainly, sexuality is something that is inherent in all human beings, and
Yeah.
leads to very powerful experiences very quickly. So one, would certainly anticipate that, if you had sort of the choice of achieving a mystical experience through doing Om for, a few times, versus spending 30 years in a monastery in Tibet, meditating, um,
Right.
one might, go the quicker route. But again, there's other parts to this, which, then you get into, the kind of the more philosophical or even theological, which is which ones have meaning, and which ones, what does one learn from these experiences. And so, could one argue that the experience that one has through orgasmic meditation is more profound, less profound, just different?
Yeah.
That it gets very hard. I mean, in my world of neurotheology, I try very hard never to make direct comparisons, because I really believe this, that I don't think there's one approach that is the right for everyone.
Totally.
And so, we were talking about psychedelics earlier, psychedelic people who have psychedelic experiences, some people have incredible spiritual
Yeah.
experiences. Some people have bad experiences. So, so it's, and of course, if you have if you're a college student who goes to a party and has some mushrooms or something, magic mushrooms, and you have some crazy experience, probably not going to, you may not necessarily refer to that as a mystical experience, or
Right.
certainly it may not necessarily have any profound spiritual influence on your life. Maybe it will, but probably less likely. Whereas if, a lot of the research that's being done with psychedelics really tries to create an environment and a context for that, which is, which hopefully would lead to a more profound kind of an experience. So, context matters, prevailing, the existing belief system matters. And then, of course, the practices themselves can certainly have a very, powerful impact depending on the person and how it's done and when it's done and so forth. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that given what we know about sexuality and the ability to create very, intense stimulation in a relatively brief period of time, it certainly makes sense that that this could be an avenue that can help people achieve these kinds of experiences in a relatively short period of time. But there's more to it than that always, and it's
Yeah.
it is what it's what people do with it, and it's how people think about it and how they put it into their own metaphysical
Context,
or physical
totally.
perspective of the world and all that. So there's a lot left for us to learn and that in and of itself, in the world of neurotheology, it's not just about the experiences, but then it goes into, well, what do people make of them? And what is it that makes one person have a spiritual experience? We saw this in this survey that we ran of people's spiritual experiences. Some people would have it and they would be, I need to go back to my, Catholic roots. I've got to become a very intense Catholic. And then other people who are also Catholic would say, it was like nothing that Catholicism ever taught me. I have to go in a completely different direction. So again, what's going on in the brain of somebody who says, I got to go in this direction versus I got to go in a different direction. How much does the existing beliefs and ideas that a person has, how did that take them down one path or another? And these are the fascinating questions for us left to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. This is great. Okay. So maybe I'll ask this last one in closing, and we can have a part 2 if we'd like.
Okay.
Why do you think sex is not respected as a legitimate way to access the mystical state?
Well, I think the argument that I made in Sex, God, and the Brain, which is I would stand by, and I think is probably a pretty reasonable explanation for that, is that I think that there's trepidation over the fact that if based on what we're finding with orgasmic meditation, what describing from a theoretical perspective in terms of the evolutionary basis of these different experiences and practices, that that sexuality and spirituality appear to be utilizing the same or extremely similar neurobiology. And so I think there's for the traditions that have kind of moved away from sexuality, I think they perceive sexuality as a kind of threat. It's kind of usurping that biology. It's sort of it's distracting you from the true spiritual state. And again, that really gets into more of a theological perspective, I guess, more than anything. And then, of course, there are other traditions that say, well, wait a minute, this is an inherent power and energy of us as human beings. Let's use that to get into our spiritual experiences and into our spiritual states. Yeah, and so I think that while there are traditions that have tried to embrace sexuality, the idea that there is this kind of concern about usurping, as I said, the same, that it would somehow deflect us and distract us from finding what is the true spiritual meaning of different experiences. So I think that's probably the issue. And I think that the more research can be done, just like with psychedelics,
Right.
when people started to ask people what these experiences are, and we published, my colleagues and I published an article when we did our survey of the psychedelically related experiences versus the non-psychedelic experiences, and there was tremendous similarity between them. So, which again, who's to say that one kind of an experience is better than or worse than another? I think a lot really depends on how it affects that individual person and what they take from it and what they do with it. So, I mean, ultimately, all of this, at least in my me personally is it's about trying to understand the nature of reality, and that to me is always what is so fascinating, is that we all have our individual perspectives, and so it's a matter of trying to understand those different perspectives and where they come from, as opposed to trying to say that, well, one particular perspective is better than or worse than. And again, even from an evolutionary perspective, one of the things that kind of got warped even in the idea of trying to understand what Darwin was talking about is that it's not that there is a better kind of animal or a worse kind of animal. It's a better for the moment kind of animal.
Right. Yes.
It's a more adaptive animal in the moment. And human beings obviously have taken over the world. But if we ultimately blow ourselves up and then, cockroaches take over the world, well, were cockroaches better than human beings? Not necessarily. They just
Right.
became more adaptive at some point, when human beings were no longer as adaptive. So, and there's always these profound balances I mean, I talk about this in the book also, Sex, God, and the Brain, where, I mean, sexuality, spirituality, I mean, these can all be things that are wonderful and, fulfill a person's life and connect people and create intimacy and love and compassion and so forth. And they can also lead to great harm. So I mean, sexuality obviously, and that's probably the other piece to the answer to your question, which is that unfortunately, because sexuality is such a driving force of humanity, it can lead to things like like the Catholic child sexual abuse and things like that. So it can lead people to doing bad things with sexuality. And I guess the people who are spiritual are trying to avoid that, without realizing that spirituality has led to lots of bad stuff too.
Totally.
I
Yeah.
think it's the nature of us.
Yeah, totally. It's like they say in Buddhism, aim your attention toward bodhicitta, toward, doing to be of benefit in the world. And so,
Right.
My question always is, what would happen if the sexual impulse was liberated? And in that liberation, it was aimed toward creation. It's
Right.
we all come from the creation of the sexual impulse. And so they're just
Right.
really fascinating questions to think about.